let me go ahead and get into it. And we will talk about the history of enslavement in America. Now that we've pretty well covered why slavery was different, American slavery was different than slavery throughout history. Let's talk about the history of what happens with slaves in America. Okay, just to give you kind of a broad timeline. Y'all remember a lecture where we talked about the Great Awakening, and we talked about John Wesley coming over to America and having kind of a bad experience here and then going back to England, and then having this massive following of people who followed him after that. So in 1772, John Wesley published something called Thoughts Upon Slavery. And it was a point by point argument against owning slaves. It was an argument that was very compelling. He took everything that slave owners ever said about why it was okay for them to own slaves, and he argued against it. And it's an extremely thorough document. You're really lucky I don't assign it to you in this class, because I do assign it to in some classes, and that's hard reading. Things like if we didn't rescue them from their lives in Africa, they would still be living in a jungle situation where, you know, they were basically living in the trees as animals. That was an argument that was made by slave owners. John Wesley points to exactly what civilization really looks like according to the accounts of Europeans interacting in Africa to debunk that.
You did assign it.
I didn't assign it in this class.
Am I getting my classes confused? Okay.
Yeah, I assigned it in my World Civ class. I don't assign it in this class.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I remember writing about it.
Yeah, and it's hard reading. It's hard work. But he published that document, and it had kind of a big effect. A lot of people read it, and most of the people who read it were in England. And the English people who read it were followers of him, and his movement was really big. Anyway, also in the same year, a slave sued his owner in London for owning him, basically. And you have to understand that the English law is made out of something called common law. It had been pulled together over the centuries out of the individual sort of laws of different areas throughout England and piled into one law called the common law. England wasn't shaped by a constitution from the get-go like America was. It wasn't shaped from the beginning through documentation. It was pulled together out of laws from a lot of places. And he went to court to sue his owner in England, saying there's no place in the common law that says it's legal to own slaves, even though people had been doing it for a couple of centuries, and there were about 10,000 slaves in households in London at the time. He went to court to say there's no place in the common law that says it's legal to own slaves in England. And because of John Wesley's thoughts upon slavery, and because of the fact that it was true, there was no place in the common law that said they could, and because of a rising awareness of all of the horrors of the Middle Passage, England outlawed slavery. So they found in his favor, and that kicked off a series of events that ends up with, by 1807, international slave trade is outlawed in all of the British Empire, which means in India and in South America and in West Indies and all the places that Britain is at that point. International slave trade is outlawed, and by 1833, it's completely abolished in all of the British Empire. Okay, it is now illegal in all of the British Empire, which is North America is not part of anymore, to own slaves at all. Okay, and one of the ways that they carried this off was by paying slave owners for their losses in the West Indies. So remember, we were talking the other day about gentlemen in England who owned sugar plantations in the West Indies and who owned slaves, and then talked really big about how nice it was to have slaves because it supported their households in England. By 1833, that had been abolished, but in 1833, they were also given money to compensate them for the loss of their slaves, which they then turned around and used to pay their slaves, so that they weren't slaves anymore. So you have this whole sort of rippling wave of change within the British Empire, where suddenly workers in sugarcane plantations that are still owned by Englishmen are navigating and negotiating their wages. And some of them were pretty slimy about it. Like they would charge rent for the houses that their slaves had had been living in their whole lives. They'd say, okay, now you're free technically. You don't really have any place you can go. So you can stay here. We're going to pay you a wage, but we're going to take rent for your cottage out of that wage. So it's going to come out to, not very much money. So they were, sneaky about it. But the fact of the matter is that the power to negotiate whether or not you stayed and kept that job was actually in the hands of the former slaves, which made a huge difference throughout the British Empire. That's not what happened in America. Not even close. Okay, hold on. Yeah, and if you're interested in what that actually looks like in practice, there's a mini series called The Long Song that you can watch. I watched it once and I was sorry I'd watched it, but it made me very well feel more educated about that whole attitude of former slave owners and their new wage earners. In America, Whitefield, who was John Wesley's fanboy when he started off in ministry, but then kind of got bigger than him in America, wrote about his thoughts about slavery in a journal. And George Whitefield did not believe that slavery in itself is evil. He believed that it was possible for a slave owner to be evil, to treat their slaves badly, but he didn't believe it was necessarily wrong to own slaves the way John Wesley did. And they actually went head to head on this issue and argued about it extensively. His journal was published when he died in 1749. And people who had this dead man's journal and this dead man's writings who were, and y'all remember, Ben Franklin giving money to George Whitefield because he was so moved by him and all that. This was a man with a lot of religious power in America up until his death. And even after his death, all of his writings got published, everything that he wrote, and people couldn't ask him, have your thoughts on this changed, because he was dead now. So John Wesley, who's still alive, is basically having one side of an argument with George Whitefield, who is dead and whose opinions are never going to change. And people who, had to decide which side of this issue they were coming down on tended to drift towards George Whitefield, okay? Between 1772 and 1776 was that period where English taxes became so heavy on American commerce. And in 1791, there was a Haitian Revolution in which the slaves actually overturned the power of their masters. They actually overran the plantation owners and took over their own island, which was the thing that Southern plantation owners were most afraid of. And it actually happened in Haiti, which was right off the coast of Florida, which is really close to American soil. In 1792, the cotton gin is invented, which creates a huge need for slaves. And in 1787, the Constitution is written, which includes a fugitive slave law, okay? It's written right into the Constitution that runaway slaves will be returned to their masters to the states from which they come. So it's written right into the Constitution to protect slavery in America. Okay, so here we have in 1772 a slave suing for his freedom on the basis of what is written in the law, what is not written in the law. And here in America, we have it written right into the law that slaves will be returned to their masters if they run away. The international slave trade was outlawed in America, but what that really did was just create a vacuum for faster ships and more sneakiness on the part of American slave traders. And in 1832 and 1833, there's a crisis in South Carolina over the tariffs, and that becomes a conversation between slave owners and northern sort of abolitionists because of that. So the arc in England is that reason, enlightenment, thinking, all of those kind of things, purging out the law, led to the abolition of slavery until the British Empire became an anti-slavery country, an anti-slavery empire in all of its holdings. In America, it goes kind of the other direction. Actually, slavery becomes more important to the American economy and the law becomes more attached to it. In 1619, the first slaves to arrive in Jamestown were not really slaves. We talked about this the other day. They were listed as indentured servants in all the census counts at first in 1623, but as labor in the Virginian tobacco plantations became harder and harder to get to, Virginia started to change its laws to incorporate perpetual servitude. to keep slaves where they were. So that by 1756, there were 120,000 people of African descent living in Virginia, where there were 170,000 whites. So there's almost the same number of blacks as whites in Virginia as a result of this. So some of the biggest myths about slavery in America: slavery is necessary to the economy only in the South. That's absolutely not true. It's in the South where most of the slave labor force is, but all of the industries that feed into that labor force feeds into take most of their exits in the North. In the North, you have banks that lend money to slave owners in the South to purchase slaves with, and therefore are dependent on the slave trade. You have shipping industries in the North. You have textile mills that rely on the cotton being grown in the North. The truth is that the entire economy of America had cashed in on slavery. So that's a myth, just that it's just particular to the South. However, the rise of abolitionism actually takes place in the North. People wanting to abolish slavery takes place in the North, but the people who benefit financially from slavery are still living in the North. Bank owners, shipping industries, textile mills, they're all still living in the North. Slavery is the natural state of a particular race of men is a myth that was perpetuated and perpetuated and perpetuated. They actually point to a specific verse in the Bible that has something to do with Cain in Genesis that says that because and it's mistranslation it's the mistranslation in the 1600s that darker skin is actually a punishment for, Cain murdering his brother. And that version of scripture is actually like written in and then written back out. Like they mistranslate it and then they fix it almost immediately. But people still hold on to that idea. And then they said, if you tried to give these people freedom, there's no way that they would know what to do with it. They're happier this way. That's a myth. That was one of the biggest myths. Another one is the worst thing about slavery is the physical pain. Most of the time when we cringe at the thought of studying slavery, what we are envisioning is whipping and shackles and all of that kind of stuff. But the truth is the worst thing about slavery is the loss of personal autonomy. And the biggest way that expresses itself is through the fact that a mother who is a slave has no say in whether or not she gets to keep her children. A child who is a slave has no right to know who his parents are. And that's the biggest, that's the worst thing about slavery in America, is the complete loss of autonomy. And the myth that slavery is inescapable, that it can't, once somebody is put into a position of slavery, they just, that's their life from then on, and they can't escape. This quote is African slavery that makes every white man in some sense a lord. One of the ways that this manifests in America is that even the poorest, most uneducated, most worthless, idiot white person outranks every black person, because black people are a race of slaves in America. So even the lowest ranking, most dirt scraping white person still can comfort himself that he is a lord compared to them. So the biggest, one of the biggest things that it creates is this caste system in America that has nothing to do with education, value, intelligence, skill, anything like that, because the most skilled, advanced, innovative slave is still outranked by the lowest, the lowest ranking, most idiot white person in the country. But they don't know how to make it stop. They don't know how to let go of this. Thomas Jefferson actually said slavery is an abomination and must be loudly proclaimed as such. Jefferson, who owned, remind me again, how many slaves himself? Do y'all remember? Like in the hundreds? And at least one that he was having a whole family with. Slavery is an abomination and must be loudly proclaimed as such, but I own that I nor any other man has any immediate solution to the problem. You can't just quit slavery. Everything would fall apart if you did. And vengeance might be taken, actually. He writes later in his letters that, we've set ourselves in a situation where we don't dare let go of slavery, because At this point, we would be justified in being punished for what we've done. And then Frederick Douglass quote, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land." This is a quote by Frederick Douglass, who is actually a escaped slave. He ran away when he was a young boy, managed to find his way to freedom. At one point in his life, somebody said, "Don't teach that boy to read. If he learns to read, he'll be unfit to be a slave." And he thought, okay, so that's what I need to do. And he became one of the most educated people he could, in order that he could write his story, and so he could no longer be fit to be a slave. So, okay. So in 1821, I want to say 1821. Yeah. No, because it would have been during Napoleon's time, so it would have been 1805. Yeah, in 1805, the a revolution took place in the French holdings of Haiti, which resulted in slaves rising up and overthrowing their masters. And it's a really fascinating story about Toussaint Louverture and how they ended up declaring themselves an independent empire, and how it went a completely different direction than the French soldiers had in mind. All we really need to know for the sake of our colonies, of our states up here, is that it happened so close to American soil that it changed the way that American slave owners treated their slaves. The idea that you could leave the plane, that you could wander, that you didn't need to be guarded, went out the window. The idea that slaves might be gathering. Up until this point, slaves often gathered to have worship services or to have, social gatherings across plantations. But because of this, suddenly Southern slave owners began to try to stop that from happening. There's an interesting thing that happens in the churches at the time. In the South, it used to be that, preachers would come through and preach messages to the slaves and have little revivals for the slaves and gather them together. At this point, churches began to insist that slaves attend church with their masters. So it actually integrated churches as opposed to segregating them. They just had to sit up in the balcony. They had to sit up in the balcony, but they had to be in attendance, because that way we could make sure that they're not using the church services as a time to gather and foment rebellion. Right after the Civil War, they're going to be segregated again. But during this time, educating slaves became very dangerous. The idea of providing education, providing an opportunity to network, all of those things changed as a result of this. We've already done that. So the question that becomes really important, okay, bye, Jordan. The question that becomes really important is, how far are we going to carry this slave plantation ideology as we now move west? Because we are manifest destiny. We're spreading into the west. We just won the battle against Texas, which gave us all of California. So now we have some decisions to make about whether or not to perpetuate this, slave society. Most Southerners say yes, we have to perpetuate the slave society. Northerners and Westerners say no. So let's take a look at why. The Southern way of life that centers around that plantation aristocracy, it moves with the seasons. So it's very dependent on the mercy of the climate and the mercy of the seasons. It's not something that can be regimented, standardized like factories can. You can't build a plantation and trust it to always run exactly on the schedule you would have it run on. It runs on the schedule the land would have it run on. It depends entirely on cash crops that use slave labor force to thrive, okay? And it requires constant new soil. In order for the plantation society to survive, it has to expand. These cash crops kill the soil. Cotton kills the soil, tobacco kills the soil. So you need new soil to move it on to. But also the idea of aristocracy is, this is my land, my son needs his own land. Okay, otherwise we're a failing family. If our family is doing well and we're wealthy, we should be expanding. If we stop expanding, then we're starting to fall and our wealth is no longer what it used to be. That's the way aristocracy works. It's expansionist. Okay? So in order for Southern society to continue, it has to expand. So this is all a part of the Southern way of life. So as they're looking out west, what they're seeing is more land to expand this aristocracy out into, more land to expand these cash crops out into, more space to manage the lowest class of the population into. Northern abolitionists object to all expansion of slavery. We have an opportunity here at this moment to stop it right here, to let it die out, to fence it in so that it will eventually, all of the soil will get worn out by the cash crops and they'll have to move on to something else. It's time to let it go. They believed that if you did that, then slavery would end. And the more states there were free soil states, the more representative in the government they would be, which was good to the North. If the northern states have most of the power, then they get to make all of the decisions in Congress and the legislature. We've seen some of that play out, like in recent days, that the House of Representatives and Congress sort of depend on the voices that populate it. Westerners objected because this was the opportunity for Westerners to get out from under aristocrats. And also, a lot of cases, Westerners didn't particularly want slavery in the West because they wanted the West to be populated by white people. And if you put slaves out there, then there are black people out there. So a lot of times the Westerners, the reason that they objected to slavery expanding into the new states was actually a racist thing. The Appalachian people didn't want to move into new territory and have to look at non-white people when they were there. So they didn't want slavery to move into those areas with them. Most of the Westerners that we're talking about are small farmers, small ranchers and small farmers, and who don't benefit from those cash crop economies anyway. But they just wanted to move into a West that was free of all of that. So in 1787, when we first made laws about expanding into the new states, we had a very simple system. Not simple, there's nothing simple about this land ordinance, but it was still in charge. So the population moves into the area, enough of a population moves in there, then they get declared a state, okay? But there's a minimum amount of population that has to move into an area in order for it to be declared a state. You can't have a voice in Congress unless you are a state. So the goal is move enough of the people you like into an area, and then they will form a state that agrees with your thinking and your way of life, and then that's who will have a voice in Congress. So whole communities would form, like specifically to move and settle into areas in the hopes that their community would be reflected in the legislature. But in 1820, the land ordinance declared that all land below a certain latitude would be free, or above a certain latitude would be free, and below a certain latitude would be slave, to prevent this exact thing from happening. But they were talking about settling the Louisiana territory, which is this, because they weren't thinking about this yet. This all belonged to Mexico. So they were thinking, as new states get added, these will be free and these will be slave, okay? Except that by that time, Missouri had already been pretty heavily populated by slave owners, and it was above that line. So they made a compromise saying, except Missouri. Okay, Missouri can be a slave state, but everything else north of this line needs to be free. But since what they were talking about expanding into was this area, most abolitionists thought that was a great idea because most of the territory is above that line. And then we won this from Mexico, okay? So they have to make a decision at this point of how to handle this line as it moves into Mexico. The Wilmot proposal or proviso was penned by, yes, sure. Okay. Everybody has a different idea of how to deal with this problem. As new states are added, should they be slave states or free states? Everybody has a different idea. When it's formed, it's the Louisiana territory, but when this big chunk of land gets taken from Mexico and added, They have to solve a different problem. The barn burners believed that it should just be no new slave states at all. Absolutely no new slave states. As a matter of fact, the Gadsden Purchase in 1846 was actually, this proviso was attached to that purchase. So that little piece of land that gets purchased right at the end of the Texas-Mexico War, he tried to attach this and sneak it in so that it wouldn't get too much attention. Instead, it becomes a major debate about whether or not new states should be slave states or not. And a barn burner in this case is somebody who believes the whole system should be burned down. Just destroy all slavery, free all slaves, just get rid of the whole institution. A hunkerer is somebody who believes that slavery will go away if you just, fence it in, make sure that nobody can have new slave states. Slavery will eventually die. It's not carried. They don't agree. They don't decide to pass the Wilmot Proviso, but everybody who argues about it becomes, are you part of this part of Congress or part of that part of Congress? Okay, it's like the pro-life debate. It becomes the thing that divides the entire Congress. Either you were for this or you were against it. And if you were for it, then you're this side of the aisle. And if you were against it, you were that side of the aisle. This is the first time that that has been the thing that divided Congress. Because like I said, there were Northern people who supported slavery and Southern people who didn't. But this is the moment where it becomes this half of Congress versus that half of Congress. So the reason that they have to make this decision quickly is because in 1846, or in 1848, gold is discovered in California. So the land ordinance says that if enough people fill an area, then it can start applying for statehood, and suddenly lots and lots of people are filling these areas. They thought they had all kinds of time to fill all of this new territory, that they've gotten from Spain. But then gold is discovered in California, and suddenly people are flooding into the area as fast as they can, okay? There were 8,000 people in California when California became part of the United States. There were 8,000 people. You know, there aren't 8,000, there are more than 8,000 people in like FAUC, okay? I think, I don't actually know, it's possible. The 8,000 is not a lot of people, okay? That was in 1846. By 1850, there were 100,000 people. So that's how fast it filled up. So now they've got to make a decision about this very, very quickly. So did they just draw the line across the whole board? The Missouri Compromise line? All of these states will come in as slave states, but California won't. Or do they expand the Missouri Compromise across? Make all the states north of Missouri free states? How do they handle this situation? What's the decision that they can make? What can they even do? California, this is where the line comes across California. This is where that Missouri Compromise line comes across California. So does California get admitted mostly as a free state? Does it get admitted as a slave state? So that's the conundrum that they're going to have as they move west. And that's going to be the thing that they fight about, is whether or not this ideology of enslavement can actually be perpetuated and continue, or whether it should be caged in and stopped. And we're going to talk more about that next week. Now we're going to talk about something completely different. You guys had a reading assignment, not a reading assignment, but you have a document to read this week called Slavery in Their Own Words. Have y'all taken a look at that yet? I don't blame you, but you need to. It's got two stories in it. One is Equiano's story, and one of them is a story by Harriet Jacobs of her own experiences. Equiano's story is about the Middle Passage. Harriet Jacobs is the story of somebody who was born a slave in America, and her experiences growing up in a household. So they're both pretty rough, but one of the things about rough conversations like this and rough topics like this is that people tend to use passive voice when they're talking about them. And in history, we try not to write in passive voice. So we're going to do a little bit of an exercise on passive voice. Have y'all heard of passive voice? Do you know what passive voice is? Yes? No? Not sure? Okay, one of the things that's on your rubric for your paper is not to use passive voice. So here are examples of passive voice. The ball was kicked. The goal was scored. The student was injured. What do you notice that's similar about all of those sentences? Right, right. So what does that tell you? Let's take the first one. The ball was kicked. Yeah.
Past tense, the noun, the verb.
Right, right. What else, what's missing from that sentence?
It's not detailed. It's not analyzed.
So what specifically is missing?
The object.
No, the object is the ball.
Who kicked the ball
There it is. Yeah. Who kicked it? The ball was kicked, but who kicked it? Like, this is something that happened to the ball. The ball was just sitting there and it was just completely helpless in this situation. And then kicking happened to it. Okay, that's what a passive sentence does. If you want to make it an active sentence, and you need to add a piece of information here, you need to add the player kicked the ball. Okay, let's assume the toddler kicked the ball, you know, whoever it was. You need that piece of information. Now, a lot of times what people do is they tack that piece of information onto the end and leave it passive. They say the ball was kicked by the player, which leaves it passive because everything that's happening in this sentence is happening helplessly to the noun of the sentence. It's just sitting there and kicking happened to it and there was this player who did it. Okay, but if you want to make it active voice, then you swap it and say the player kicked the ball. Okay, the goal was scored. I can't tell you the number of times that has happened. The only reason why you would say that is because you didn't know who scored the goal and you didn't want to betray that you didn't know it. It's very weak writing. Anna scored the goal. There you go. I don't know if that's even possible. No? No, you don't think so? Okay. Well, say what?
I can't even kick a soccer.
Okay, so we're talking about soccer here specifically.
Oh, we don't have to talk about soccer.
I'm just saying, could you score a goal if it was basketball?
Maybe.
Okay. You can't score a goal if it's baseball because that's not how that works.
I hit a home run.
Sports ball. Anyway,
I hit a home run.
you can hit a home run. Okay. The home run was hit. Nobody would write that sentence. Nobody would ever say it that way. Not only would information be missing, but it would also be really weak. You don't want to say it that way. You want to say, Anna hit a home run. Anna scored a goal. Okay. A lot of times when people are using passive voice, it's in situations like this. The student was injured. Okay. The student was assaulted. You leave it passive because it's softer on the blame. Okay. The student was injured by the car, you know, or something like that. It's just, you can leave a lot of information out and people don't notice. Where this becomes an issue is in a lot of cases in history writing is that it makes for junky writing. It makes it unclear. It's not grammatically incorrect per se, but it's incredibly weak. And in history, when we deliver information in a paper in history, we want the facts to be as clean and boring as possible. So we don't want there to be we don't want the opportunities for have to tack on a bunch of information at the end of a sentence. We want it very, very clear. Okay, so Frederick Douglass was freed. No, Frederick Douglass wasn't freed. Frederick Douglass ran away. Frederick Douglass achieved his own freedom, right? But one of the places that we see this the most is in writing where women are assaulted. Okay, so you're going to notice this as you read Harriet Jacobs' story, that she talks a little bit about some of the struggles that she has as a pretty woman, pretty girl who is a slave living in a household. She should talk about, I'm just sort of spoiling it for you, even though I still want you to read it, so that you'll know that there are probably trigger warnings here. But she talks about the danger of growing up pretty because your master looks at you in a way that's not appropriate and your mistress hates you in a way that's not your fault. And feels threatened by you because of the fact that the master can, you know, be attracted to you and all this kind of stuff. So this is a place where you see a lot of passive voice where it doesn't belong and the reason for that is because we want to make the language softer and weaker. We don't want to hit people over the head with it. We wanted to make it, you know, just a little more fragile so that it's not as in your face. And that's not what historians do. Historians make things, you know, factually simple. So your exercise for today is going to be to turn these sentences around, is to figure out a way to write this out of passive voice and into active voice. And these are the sentences that you've been assigned there on Blackboard I'll liberate the assignment so that you can see it. Oh gosh, where are you? There you are. Okay. We're in dividing the nation, slavery, make available. Okay, now you should be able to see it. Okay, but these are the sentences that you need to do. Let's take one of them together. Pretty black women were often resented by their owners' wives. Okay, what's the thing that's happening? What's the verb? Right, okay. So we're what? Resented, right? So the resenting is the thing that's happening. Somebody's doing some resenting around here at pretty black women. Pretty black women are having resentment done to them. We don't want that to be the way the sentence is written. We want to turn around and put the blame right where it belongs. Put the actor, the person committing the action at the beginning of the sentence, do the thing to the person they're doing it to. So who is doing all of the resenting?
The owners of the streets showed resentment towards pretty.
Right. Owners' wives often resented pretty black women. Now it's an active sentence, okay? So you take the thing at the end and you put it at the beginning and you make it like this. Harriet Jacobs was sexually targeted is harder because you don't know who is the doer in that sentence. Or you will when you read it, and I kind of just told you who sexually targeted Harriet Jacobs. Wild guess. Right, probably. Even if you haven't read the story, you can probably guess that that was who it was. Spoilers, it totally was. So the master sexually targeted Harriet Jacobs is how you would write that as an active sentence. You want to eliminate all passive voice that you possibly can from any of your historical writing. Anything, any paper that you do in a history class, you want to take out all of the, you want to make everything simple past tense, and you want to make it active voice. Simple past tense and active voice. You don't want to say they would do this, you want to say they did it. And you don't want to say they had it happen to them, you want to say who did it, okay? So this is an exercise that will be valuable to you from a grammatical standpoint, and it'll give you sort of a, put your toe in the water to start reading these two slightly harsh readings that I've given you. So that's your assignment for today, is to eliminate passive voice in these 5 sentences. And basically what will happen is that I'll give you points for the ones you get right, and I'll tell you which ones you got wrong, and you can try again. Any questions? Zoom, y'all got any questions? Where even are you?
No, ma'am.
Do I still have, oh, I have to do that. Okay. All right, so any questions from Zoom? Any questions from inside the class?